The terrifying words echoed through the empty mansion as the little girl clung desperately to her stepmother's hand. Her plea, so innocent yet so haunting, would change everything that night. Before anyone could react, the doors burst open to reveal a figure whose presence would alter their lives forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Thunder rattled the windows of Hawthorne Manor, shaking the old glass panes in their frames. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, as 6-year-old Lucy Smith crept barefoot down the shadowy hallway. The cold wooden floor sent shivers up her small legs with each tentative step. Her stuffed rabbit, worn from years of tight embraces and tear-soaked nights, was clutched against her chest like a shield. The darkness seemed to swallow her tiny figure as she moved through the corridor. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched from the walls, their eyes following her progress. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the elegant manor interior before plunging it back into shadow. Lucy's heart pounded against her ribs. She'd woken from another nightmare, the same one where everyone disappeared and left her completely alone. The thunder had only made it worse, each boom like a door slamming shut forever. "Please don't leave me alone, stepmother." Her voice came out, shivering and small, barely making it past her trembling lips. The words hung in the air, fragile as spider silk. At the far end of the hallway, Eleanor Smith stood with her elegant hand hovering at the doorknob. She had been about to step out for the evening meeting with Mr. Johnson about some legal matters. Her posture remained regal in her tailored outfit, her face a carefully composed mask of calm. But inside her chest, something fragile splintered at the sound of Lucy's plea. The stepmother turned slowly, her silhouette outlined by another flash of lightning. For a brief moment, her carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing a glimpse of the turmoil beneath. She heard Lucy, really heard her, for the first time since becoming her guardian. Not just the words, but the desperate loneliness behind them. Yet Eleanor remained frozen, caught between the instinct to comfort and the paralyzing fear of doing it wrong. What if she couldn't be what this child needed? What if she failed, just as she feared? The elegant woman's fingers tightened around the doorknob, her knuckles whitening with tension. Lucy took another step forward, her small face upturned and vulnerable in the dim light. The stuffed rabbit dangled from her hand, its button eyes reflecting a silent plea that matched its owner's. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her silence grew heavier than the storm outside, filling the space between them with unspoken fears and longings. The thunder crashed again, emphasizing the weight of the moment as stepmother and child stood separated by more than just the physical distance of the hallway. Before Eleanor could decide, the front doors crashed open with a gust of wind and rain. The sudden intrusion sent a chill through the manor's grand entryway, where water began pooling on the polished hardwood floor. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, his expensive suit soaked through, clinging to his frame. Rainwater cascaded from his dark hair down his face, but his intense gaze was already darting around the dimly lit hall. When his eyes finally landed on Lucy, something in his expression shifted, a mixture of relief and determination, replacing the wild look he'd worn seconds before. The little girl instinctively stepped back, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest. "Where is Lucy?" Graham Brown's voice boomed, echoing through Hawthorne Manor's high ceilings. The sound reverberated off the walls, making the question seem even more demanding than he'd intended. Eleanor stepped forward, her posture stiffening as she positioned herself between the millionaire and her stepdaughter. "She's right here, as you can see," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "What are you doing here at this hour, Graham? And in this weather?" The wealthy businessman took a step forward, leaving wet footprints on the floor. He ran a hand through his dripping hair, his breathing still heavy from what must have been a rushed journey. "I received a call from Robert," he said, referring to Mr. Johnson, "about the will, about Lucy's guardianship." Eleanor's face paled. She'd been dreading this moment for months, ever since her husband's death had left Lucy's future uncertain. The legal complexities of the situation had been weighing on her, but she'd hoped for more time. Graham's return to their lives wasn't motivated by revenge for past disagreements or a power play over the family estate. His purpose was something far more dangerous: the truth about promises made years ago, promises that could destroy the fragile new life Eleanor had been trying to build with Lucy, or perhaps finally heal the fractured Smith family. "We need to talk," he said, his tone softening as he noticed Lucy's frightened expression. "Not here, not in front of her." Lucy looked between the two adults, sensing the tension crackling like the lightning outside. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she recognized the way they looked at each other, like two people sharing a secret too heavy to speak aloud. "Lucy, darling," Eleanor finally said, finding her voice again, "please go upstairs to your room. I'll be up shortly." The child hesitated, her small hand reaching out toward her stepmother before dropping back to her side. With one last glance at the soaking wet visitor, she turned and disappeared up the grand staircase, leaving wet footprints of her own. Lucy shrank against the wall, her small body trembling as she clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter. The hallway suddenly felt narrower, the shadows deeper. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain both adults could hear it. Eleanor Smith moved with surprising swiftness, positioning herself between the child and Graham Brown, her elegant frame creating a barrier that was both protective and possessive. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor's voice was cold, but beneath the ice, something cracked. For a fleeting moment, her carefully maintained composure faltered. The fear of losing control, of losing Lucy, was almost visible in the slight tremble of her hands, the tightening of her jaw. Graham stood dripping on the expensive carpet, rainwater pooling around his shoes. His imposing figure softened as his eyes found Lucy peeking from behind her stepmother's skirt. The millionaire's expression changed, the urgency in his stance giving way to something gentler. "I didn't mean to frighten anyone," he said, his voice lowered. He slowly knelt down, bringing himself to Lucy's level. Water still dripped from his dark hair, running in rivulets down his face. "Lucy, I'm here for you," he continued, his tone gentle but urgent. "I've been worried." The 6-year-old felt a strange pull toward this man who spoke her name with such care, yet she didn't dare move from Eleanor's shadow. The stepmother's hand found Lucy's shoulder, fingers pressing just firmly enough to keep her in place. "It's late," Eleanor said. "This isn't appropriate. Whatever concerns you have can be addressed through Robert Johnson." Her reference to the family solicitor was deliberate, a reminder of legal boundaries. Graham's eyes never left Lucy's. "I understand," he said, though his expression suggested otherwise. "But some things can't wait for solicitors and paperwork." The tension between the adults pressed against Lucy from both sides like invisible walls. She felt simultaneously wanted and invisible, a prize being claimed rather than a child being heard. The grown-up spoke over her head in words that sounded calm, but carried currents of something deeper, something frightening. "Please," Lucy whispered, her voice so small it barely disturbed the air. Neither adult seemed to hear her. Rain continued to beat against the windows of Hawthorne Manor, echoing the rhythm of Lucy's heart. She clutched her rabbit closer, wishing it could whisper advice in her ear. The stuffed toy remained silent, its button eyes reflecting the hallway light, as the two adults, one desperate, one terrified, stood on opposite sides of her future. By morning, the storm had passed, but the chill lingered in the manor's grand rooms like an unwelcome guest. Eleanor Smith found herself watching 6-year-old Lucy eat breakfast, unable to look away from the child's small hands trembling around her spoon. The girl's gaze remained fixed on the window, her eyes scanning the garden as if searching for someone who might disappear at any moment. "Would you like more toast?" Eleanor asked, her voice softer than intended. Lucy nodded without looking at her stepmother, clutching her stuffed rabbit closer with her free hand. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9 when the doorbell rang, its sound echoing through Hawthorne Manor with an ominous finality. Eleanor smoothed her skirt, composing herself before answering. Graham Brown stood on the doorstep, his tall frame no longer drenched but impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of his wealth. The millionaire's face was set with determination, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "I've brought the necessary documentation," he stated without preamble, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. His eyes softened only when they landed on Lucy, who had appeared in the doorway of the dining room, rabbit dangling from her fingers. "Good morning, Lucy," he said gently, his entire demeanor transforming. "I hope you slept well after the storm." The child nodded, her eyes darting between the adults with the wariness of someone accustomed to disappointment. "Mr. Johnson will be arriving shortly," Eleanor said, her voice maintaining its practiced calm despite the flutter of panic in her chest. As if summoned by her words, another knock announced the family solicitor's arrival. Robert Johnson entered with the quiet efficiency that had served the Smith family for years. His gray suit matched his demeanor, neutral, professional, revealing nothing of his thoughts as he greeted everyone with a polite nod. They gathered in the study, Lucy sent upstairs with promises of attention later. Graham spread the legal papers across the antique desk, his finger tapping on key paragraphs. "We need a full review of Lucy's guardianship," he announced, looking directly at Eleanor and the solicitor. "The current arrangement was meant to be temporary. I believe circumstances have changed." Mr. Johnson adjusted his glasses, examining the documents without comment. Eleanor's hands tightened around her teacup, the fine bone china suddenly fragile in her grip. The threat of losing Lucy became painfully real, solidifying from abstract fear into tangible danger. "On what grounds?" she finally asked, proud that her voice didn't betray the tremor she felt inside. Graham leaned forward. "On the grounds that Lucy deserves more than a reluctant caretaker. She needs someone who can truly be there for her." The solicitor cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss this with Lucy's best interests as our primary concern." Eleanor set down her cup, the quiet clink masking the sound of her world beginning to crumble. Lucy's world grew colder as the adults debated her fate in hushed tones behind closed doors. She would press her ear against the wooden panels, catching fragments of conversation that made her stomach twist into knots. Legal rights, best interests, and emotional stability were phrases that floated through the manor like ghosts, haunting the 6-year-old who understood only that her future hung in the balance. Her nightmares intensified with each passing night. She would wake screaming, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, her stuffed rabbit clutched desperately against her chest. "Eleanor!" she would cry out, her voice echoing down the hallway. But the response she craved rarely came in those vulnerable moments. What Lucy didn't know was that Eleanor Smith would silently enter her room long after she had cried herself back to sleep. The stepmother would stand in the doorway, elegant fingers gripping the frame, watching the rise and fall of the child's chest. Sometimes she would approach, adjusting the blanket or gently brushing hair from Lucy's forehead before retreating without a word. These tender gestures remained invisible to the little girl who needed them most. During the daylight hours, Graham Brown became Lucy's unexpected source of comfort. He would visit in the afternoons, bringing small treats and sitting with her in the garden when the weather permitted. "Your father loved days like this," he would say, his voice warm with memory. He would pack a basket with sandwiches and lemonade, and we'd spend hours under the apple trees in the orchard. Lucy would lean forward, eyes wide and hungry for every detail. "Did he tell jokes?" "Eleanor doesn't tell jokes." The worst jokes, Graham would laugh. He once spent an entire picnic making up riddles about the clouds. He would describe how her father had taught her to make daisy chains when she was barely able to walk, or how he would carry her on his shoulders through the village. These stories planted seeds of longing in Lucy's heart that bloomed into something Eleanor couldn't understand. The child began drawing pictures of picnics and orchards she'd never visited, creating memories she wished were her own. She would leave these drawings where Eleanor might find them, silent invitations that the stepmother observed with a mixture of jealousy and helplessness. Eleanor watched this growing bond between Lucy and the millionaire with unease, unable to compete with the ghost of a father made perfect through Graham's stories. She wanted to reach out, to create her own traditions with Lucy, but something always held her back, a fear so deep that even Frances couldn't name it for her. Eleanor Smith stood at the doorway, watching Lucy and Graham Brown huddled together over a picture book. Their laughter echoed through the manor, a sound that should have warmed her heart, but instead sent tendrils of jealousy creeping through her chest. The millionaire had a natural ease with Lucy that Eleanor couldn't seem to find within herself. He's only known her for weeks, Eleanor thought, smoothing her skirt with trembling fingers. Every time she tried to reach for Lucy, to offer comfort or affection, something inside her seized up. The words she rehearsed in private moments evaporated on her tongue, leaving only awkward silence. That afternoon, rain drummed against the windows of Hawthorne Manor, casting the house in a melancholy gray light. With Lucy napping and Graham gone to meet with Robert Johnson about the legal proceedings, Eleanor found herself drawn to the attic. She told herself she was simply organizing, but truthfully, she was searching for something, anything, that might help her connect with the child who slept under her roof, yet remained a stranger. Behind a stack of old paintings, Eleanor discovered a dusty wooden box she'd never seen before. The brass clasp was tarnished but opened easily under her touch. Inside, nestled among dried lavender sprigs, lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately. Lucy's mother. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the first letter, dated just 3 months before the accident that claimed both of Lucy's parents. "Dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've taken on the enormous task of raising my daughter. I want you to know this wasn't a choice made from desperation or lack of options. I chose you because I've watched how you love, deeply, fiercely, even when you hide it behind that careful composure." Eleanor sank to the dusty floor, tears blurring her vision as she read letter after letter. They revealed a friendship deeper than she'd acknowledged, a trust she hadn't realized she'd earned. Lucy's mother had seen through her reserve, recognizing the capacity for love Eleanor herself doubted. The final letter ended with words that made Eleanor's heart constrict. "Lucy deserves a second chance at a mother's love. And perhaps, my dear friend, you deserve a second chance at family, too." Eleanor clutched the letters to her chest, understanding washing over her like a tide. She hadn't been chosen out of obligation or pity. She'd been chosen out of love and hope. For Lucy, yes, but also for herself. The realization didn't erase her fears, but it gave her something she hadn't had before: permission to try. The arrival of Frances Davis was as unexpected as it was transformative. The elderly woman swept into Hawthorne Manor with a flurry of no-nonsense energy, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she observed the household dynamics. Eleanor Smith greeted her aunt with polite restraint, the familiar stiffness in her shoulders betraying her discomfort at having another witness to her struggling relationship with Lucy. "For heaven's sake, Eleanor," Frances remarked after dinner, when Lucy had retreated to the window seat with her stuffed rabbit. "That child looks at you like you might vanish at any moment, and you're standing there like you're posing for a portrait. You're acting like a governess, not family." Eleanor flinched at the blunt assessment. "I'm doing my best," she whispered, conscious of Lucy's small form just across the room. "Your best needs to involve your heart, not just your head," her aunt replied, her weathered hands gently squeezing Eleanor's arm. "That little girl needs warmth, not perfect posture." Later that evening, Frances found Lucy alone in the hallway, trailing her fingers along the wallpaper. "How about we make some proper bread together?" the elderly woman suggested, her eyes twinkling. Nothing heals a home like the smell of baking. In the kitchen, Frances rolled up her sleeves and pulled out flour, yeast, and salt. She placed a small apron around Lucy's thin frame and demonstrated how to knead the dough with firm, loving strokes. "Push with your palms." "That's it," she encouraged as Lucy's small hands pressed into the soft mixture. Soon, flour dusted Lucy's nose and cheeks, and for the first time in weeks, genuine laughter bubbled from her lips. The sound carried through the manor, reaching Eleanor as she sat alone with paperwork regarding Graham Brown's latest custody inquiries. Drawn by the unfamiliar sound, Eleanor found herself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching as her aunt guided Lucy's hands. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, so different from the cold silence that had permeated the house for months. "Join us," Frances called, not looking up from the dough. "This bread needs 3 pairs of hands to be properly blessed." Eleanor hesitated, but Lucy's hopeful glance pulled her forward. Awkwardly at first, she rolled up her sleeves and placed her hands in the flour. Lucy's small fingers occasionally brushed against hers, leaving traces of dough and possibility. By the time the bread went into the oven, something had begun to shift in the atmosphere of Hawthorne Manor, small but undeniable. As they sat together waiting for the bread to rise, Eleanor found herself telling Lucy about making bread with Frances as a child, her voice softer than usual. That night, the 3 of them shared worn slices slathered with butter, and for a moment, they felt almost like family. Lucy's teacher, Mrs. Bennet, pulled Eleanor aside after school, her expression grave. "Lucy refused to join group activities again today," she explained. "When Charlotte wouldn't share crayons, Lucy burst into tears and hid under the desk for nearly an hour." Eleanor Smith nodded stiffly, clutching her handbag. The familiar weight of inadequacy settled on her shoulders as she glanced at her stepdaughter waiting by the coat rack, small fingers fidgeting with her stuffed rabbit's ear. "Perhaps Lucy needs more stability," Mrs. Bennet suggested carefully. "Children sense tension at home. Has there been any resolution regarding her living situation?" Word traveled quickly in their village. By afternoon, Graham Brown had heard the same concerns from the headmistress herself. He arrived at Hawthorne Manor unannounced, his expensive vehicle crunching on the gravel drive just as Eleanor was preparing Lucy's dinner. "We need to talk," Graham announced, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "Lucy's school called me too." Eleanor's spine stiffened. "I'm handling it," she replied, her voice deliberately measured despite the panic rising in her chest. "Are you?" Graham challenged. "Because from where I stand, she's falling apart while we argue over who deserves her more." Lucy appeared in the hallway, her presence freezing both adults mid-sentence. Her eyes darted between them, calculating as only children of conflict can, measuring the tension, predicting who might crack first. "Lucy, darling, why don't you go upstairs and wash up?" Eleanor suggested, her tone artificially bright. After Lucy reluctantly disappeared upstairs, the 2 adults faced each other across the kitchen island. "We need a schedule," Graham said, running a hand through his hair. "Consistent days with each of us. Structure." "And shuttle her between homes like a parcel?" Eleanor countered. Their conversation circled painfully, old wounds reopening with each exchange. Eleanor mentioned Lucy's father, how he'd trusted her with his daughter. Graham brought up promises he'd made to Lucy's mother years ago. The millionaire's voice cracked when he spoke of regrets, of opportunities lost to pride. Mr. Johnson had warned them both that the court would favor stability and cooperation. Yet here they were, unable to speak without history hanging between them like shattered glass. Upstairs, Lucy sat on the top step, her rabbit clutched tight against her chest. She could hear the rise and fall of their voices, though not the words. Her small body tensed with each sharp tone, relaxed with each pause. She'd become an expert at reading the currents of adult emotion, at anticipating storms. Frances had told her once that grown-ups sometimes forgot how to talk to each other when they were scared. Lucy wondered what Eleanor and Graham were scared of, and why they couldn't just be brave together, for her. The rain tapped gently against the windows of Hawthorne Manor as evening settled over the countryside. Eleanor Smith stood in the doorway of the sitting room, watching 6-year-old Lucy hunched over a picture book. The child's small shoulders were tense, her posture guarded even in moments of solitude. Eleanor's fingers closed around the wicker basket she'd brought downstairs, her knuckles whitening with uncertainty. "Lucy," she called softly, "I thought perhaps we might try something together tonight." The little girl looked up, her eyes wary but curious as Eleanor approached and settled beside her on the sofa. From the basket, Eleanor withdrew 2 wooden needles and several balls of soft, faded yarn in gentle blues and creams. "These belong to your mother," Eleanor explained, her voice catching slightly. "She was quite talented at knitting. I thought perhaps I could teach you." Lucy's fingers reached out hesitantly to touch the yarn. "Mummy made things with this?" Eleanor nodded, carefully unwinding a length of blue yarn. Her hands trembled slightly as she demonstrated how to cast on, creating the first row of stitches. The movement felt foreign. Eleanor hadn't knitted since her own childhood, when Frances had taught her during those difficult years after her parents died. "Like this?" Lucy asked, her small fingers fumbling with the needles. "Almost," Eleanor whispered. She hesitated before gently placing her hands over Lucy's, guiding them through the motions. In, around, through, and off. "That's it." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 8 as they worked. Outside, the village lights twinkled in the distance. For once, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than strained. Lucy's tongue poked out in concentration as she managed a wobbly row of stitches. "It's not very good," Lucy murmured, examining her uneven work. "It's perfect," Eleanor said firmly. "The most beautiful things aren't perfect, Lucy. They're made with care." Something shifted then. Lucy leaned into Eleanor's side, her small body relaxing for the first time. Tentatively, Eleanor wrapped an arm around the child's shoulders. When Lucy didn't pull away, Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The scarf grew slowly between them, uneven, with dropped stitches and awkward tension, yet somehow more precious than any perfectly crafted item could ever be. As Lucy's eyelids began to droop, Eleanor realized she'd never felt more vulnerable or more alive than in this fragile moment of connection. "We'll finish it tomorrow," she promised, helping Lucy gather the needles and yarn. That night, Eleanor placed their work in progress on her bedside table, her fingers lingering on the soft, imperfect stitches, each one a tiny bridge between what they had been and what they might become. The fragile peace that had settled over Hawthorne Manor lasted only 3 days. Lucy had just finished arranging her stuffed rabbit on her pillow when she heard raised voices from the study downstairs. Curious, she crept down the hallway, her small feet silent against the carpet. "She needs stability, Eleanor, not your emotional distance." Graham Brown's voice carried through the partially open door. "And you think whisking her away to your mansion is the answer?" Eleanor Smith's tone was ice cold. "You swoop in after all this time claiming to know what's best. At least I show her affection. When was the last time you told her you cared?" Lucy's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed closer to the door. Through the crack, she could see Eleanor's rigid posture and Graham's frustrated pacing. "The solicitor agrees that the current arrangement isn't working," Graham continued, waving a document. "Mr. Johnson thinks we need to reconsider the guardianship entirely." "So that's why you're really here," Eleanor whispered, "to take her away." Lucy backed away from the door, her small world crumbling. In her 6-year-old mind, the truth seemed devastatingly clear. Neither of them truly wanted her. Eleanor was forced to keep her, and Graham only wanted to win. She was just a problem to solve, a burden to bear. That night, as rain began to patter against her window, Lucy made a decision. She carefully packed her stuffed rabbit into her school backpack, along with a jumper and her favorite book. She wrote a note in wobbly letters. "Don't worry about me anymore." She waited until the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11 times. The manor had fallen silent, with only the occasional creak of settling wood. Lucy slipped down the back stairs and unlatched the kitchen door with trembling fingers. The moment she stepped outside, the rain intensified, soaking through her nightgown within seconds. The cold bit at her skin like tiny teeth, but she pressed forward, clutching her backpack to her chest. The village lay beyond the long driveway, its lights blurred by rain and distance. Lucy trudged forward, mud squelching between her toes. Her teeth chattered, and tears mixed with raindrops on her cheeks. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest, the certainty that she belonged nowhere and to no one. "They'll be happier without me to fight over," she whispered to her rabbit, now peeking from her backpack. The storm swallowed her words as she disappeared into the darkness, a small figure bent against the wind and rain. The village streets glistened under the rain, as Frances Davis and Eleanor Smith split up to cover more ground. Eleanor's elegant composure had completely dissolved, her hair plastered to her face, as she called Lucy's name with increasing desperation. Each empty alleyway and shadowed doorway sent a fresh wave of panic through her chest. "Lucy!" Eleanor's voice cracked as she peered behind a row of rubbish bins. "Please answer me." Frances, despite her age, moved with surprising speed, knocking on doors and questioning neighbors. Her practical nature served them well now, organizing impromptu search parties among concerned villagers who braved the downpour to help find the missing child. "She couldn't have gone far on those little legs," Frances reassured a shopkeeper who offered to check his storage shed. "She's just scared, poor lamb." Meanwhile, Graham Brown drove frantically through the village outskirts, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the torrential rain. The millionaire's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he checked each of Lucy's favorite spots: the duck pond, the old oak with the rope swing, the little stone bridge where they'd watched minnows dart beneath the surface. "I should have been more careful," he muttered to himself, guilt weighing heavier than the storm clouds above. She heard everything. As darkness fell, Eleanor's search led her to the village green. Through sheets of rain, she spotted a small figure huddled beneath an ancient willow tree. Her heart stopped, then raced as she recognized the outline of a child. "Lucy!" Eleanor abandoned all dignity, splashing through puddles and mud in her expensive shoes. The 6-year-old was curled into herself, soaked to the bone, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. The beloved toy was sodden, its once fluffy fur matted with rain and dirt. Lucy's lips had taken on a bluish tinge, her small body shivering violently. Eleanor dropped to her knees in the mud without hesitation, gathering the child into her arms. For once, she didn't worry about appearances or control or the proper way to behave. Tears streamed down her face, indistinguishable from the raindrops. "I've been so frightened," Eleanor whispered, rocking Lucy against her chest. "I thought I'd lost you." Lucy's teeth chattered as she looked up with wide, uncertain eyes. "You don't want me to go away?" Eleanor pressed her lips to Lucy's forehead, feeling the alarming heat of fever beneath the rain-chilled skin. Her voice broke as she finally spoke the words that had been locked inside her heart. "I do love you, Lucy. I've just been too afraid to lose you." For 3 days and nights, Lucy Smith's fever burned like wildfire. The doctor came twice daily, his face growing more concerned with each visit. The child's small body thrashed beneath the quilts, her cheeks flushed crimson against the white pillowcase. Graham Brown and Eleanor took shifts by her bedside, their previous animosity dissolving in the crucible of shared fear. The millionaire would arrive at dawn, thermos in hand, gently urging Eleanor to rest while he took over the vigil. She would return at midday, their exchanges becoming less stiff, more focused on the little girl who needed them both. "Her temperature's down 1/2 degree," Graham whispered on the second evening, hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. Eleanor nodded, her elegant posture finally crumbling as she sank into the chair beside him. "The medicine seems to be working." In her delirium, Lucy called out for both of them. Sometimes she cried for Mother, other times for Graham, her small voice breaking with need. Neither adult knew if she was fully conscious of who sat beside her, holding cool cloths to her forehead and whispering reassurances. "I should have noticed she was getting ill," Eleanor murmured on the third night, her fingers trembling as she stroked Lucy's damp hair. Graham looked up from where he'd been dozing in the corner chair. "We both failed her," he admitted. "But we're here now." It was a simple truth that somehow bridged the chasm between them. When Lucy's fever finally broke in the early hours of the fourth day, Eleanor was alone with her. The child's eyes fluttered open, clear for the first time in days, finding her stepmother's worried face. "You stayed," Lucy whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. Eleanor squeezed her hand gently. "Of course I stayed." Without thinking, she reached for the book on the nightstand, a worn copy of The Secret Garden that Frances had brought up from the library. Eleanor had never read to Lucy before, had always maintained a careful distance. But now, she opened to the first page and began to read. Her voice trembled at first, uncertain. Then it grew stronger, the words flowing like a stream over smooth stones. Lucy's eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's face, drinking in each syllable as though it were medicine more potent than any the doctor had prescribed. The sound of Eleanor's voice wrapped around Lucy like a promise, one that neither had dared hope for, but both desperately needed. Outside the window, the first tentative rays of sunlight pierced the morning mist, bathing the sick room in gentle gold. As Lucy's fever broke, the manor settled into an uneasy calm. Robert Johnson sat in the study, legal papers spread before him, his brow furrowed as he examined the will for the fourth time. The family solicitor had served the Smith family for years, but what he discovered troubled him deeply. "I believe you should see this, Frances," he said quietly, passing a document to Eleanor's aunt. Frances Davis adjusted her reading glasses, her weathered hands steady as she scanned the pages. "Neither of them has been entirely forthcoming, have they?" she murmured. Mr. Johnson nodded gravely. "It appears both Eleanor and Graham have omitted crucial details about their connection to Lucy. Their motivations run deeper than either has admitted." Later that afternoon, Frances found Eleanor alone in the garden, staring absently at the rain-soaked roses. The elderly woman settled beside her niece, her practical nature cutting through pretense. "Robert showed me the will," Frances began. "You and Graham have been dancing around the truth since this began." Eleanor's posture stiffened. "I've done what's necessary to protect Lucy." "Have you?" Frances challenged. "Or have you been protecting yourself?" The silence stretched between them until Frances reached for Eleanor's hand. "Did you know I kept all your letters? The ones you wrote after your parents died, when you were raising your brothers and sister." Eleanor turned, surprise breaking through her composed facade. "You were only 15, Frances continued, "but you shouldered everything. You became their mother, their father, their strength. You never complained, never faltered, at least not where they could see." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek, quickly brushed away. "But I watched you build those walls, dear girl. I saw how you learned to hide your heart away, believing that's what made you strong." Frances's voice softened. "That armor protected you then, but it's suffocating you now." Eleanor's hands trembled. "If I let myself love her completely and then lose her?" "That's always the risk with love," Frances said. "But your strength was never in holding back. It's in letting love in, no matter how much it hurts. From the doorway, Lucy's stuffed rabbit peeked around the corner, followed by the child's curious face. Neither woman noticed her listening, absorbing the revelation of Eleanor's past, of a young girl who had once been as alone and afraid as she was. Lucy slipped away, clutching her rabbit tighter, a new understanding dawning in her young mind. Perhaps her stepmother wasn't cold after all, just someone who had learned too young that loving deeply meant risking everything. The evening shadows stretched across the drawing room of Hawthorne Manor, as Graham Brown sat opposite Eleanor Smith, both of them exhausted from their bedside vigil. Lucy's fever had finally broken, leaving them alone with the weight of unspoken truths between them. "There's something I need to tell you," Graham said, his voice barely audible above the crackling fireplace. His usually confident demeanor had crumbled, revealing a vulnerability Eleanor had never witnessed before. He stared into his teacup, as if searching for courage. "When Richard fell ill, I offered to pay for specialists, treatments abroad, anything that might have saved him. Graham's hands trembled slightly. He refused me, said he wouldn't accept charity, even for Lucy's sake." Eleanor's breath caught. This revelation cast everything in a new light. Graham's sudden appearance, his desperate need to be part of Lucy's life. "I could have saved him," he continued, his voice breaking. "If he'd just let me help, Lucy would still have her father. And I've carried that guilt every day since." The millionaire looked up, his eyes reflecting years of unresolved grief. "When I heard you might be struggling with Lucy, I convinced myself I needed to rescue her. But the truth is, I was trying to atone for failing her father." Eleanor set down her cup, the porcelain making a soft clink against the saucer. For months, she'd seen Graham as a threat, a wealthy intruder, trying to steal the only family she had left. Now she recognized something familiar in his pain, the same desperate love that had kept her awake at night, afraid to connect with Lucy lest she lose her too. "We've both been fighting ghosts," Eleanor said softly. "I've been so terrified of not measuring up to Lucy's mother that I couldn't let myself be anything to her at all." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks dancing upward. In that moment, Eleanor saw Graham not as a rival, but as someone who understood loss as intimately as she did, someone who loved Lucy enough to face his deepest failures. "Perhaps we've been looking at this all wrong," she ventured. "Lucy doesn't need either of us to be perfect. She needs us both." Graham nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since he'd arrived at Hawthorne Manor. "Partners, Ben?" he asked, extending his hand across the space between them. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before taking it. "Partners," she agreed. Outside the window, the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, witnesses to a fragile truce that might, with care, grow into something stronger than either of them had imagined possible. Lucy began to notice the subtle changes in the manor. The air felt lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had exhaled a long-held breath. For the first time since her father's passing, she allowed herself to hope. One crisp morning, Frances Davis found Lucy watching the garden from her bedroom window. "Come along," the elderly woman said, her weathered hands already reaching for gardening gloves. "The earth needs tending." In the overgrown garden behind Hawthorne Manor, Lucy discovered a different kind of magic. Frances taught her how to prepare the soil, her blunt instructions delivered with unexpected gentleness. "Even the hardest ground can nurture life," she explained, guiding Lucy's small fingers to press seeds into dark earth. "It just needs patience and the right kind of care." Day after day, Lucy returned to their patch of soil. The repetitive tasks of weeding and watering soothed her anxious mind. When the first green shoots appeared, she squealed with delight, calling for Eleanor to come see. Her stepmother arrived with hesitant steps, but genuine wonder in her eyes. "You've done this," Eleanor said softly, kneeling beside Lucy despite her elegant clothes. The moment hung between them, fragile but real. Meanwhile, Graham Brown found himself captivated by Lucy's bedtime stories about her stuffed rabbit, Sir Hops. One evening, as Lucy described how Sir Hops built a house where all his friends could live together forever, Graham reached for his notebook. "Would you mind if I wrote that down?" he asked. Soon, their evening ritual expanded. Lucy would spin tales while Graham transcribed, occasionally suggesting plot twists or asking questions that helped her develop her ideas. The Millionaire began illustrating the stories with simple sketches that made Lucy giggle with approval. "Sir Hops never leaves his friends," Lucy explained seriously one night, clutching her beloved toy. "He promises to stay forever." Graham's pen paused. "That's what makes him special," he agreed, understanding the wish behind her words. The manuscript grew thicker as spring blossomed into summer. What had begun as simple transcription evolved into a proper children's book, each chapter reflecting Lucy's deepest desires for safety, belonging, and a family that wouldn't disappear. Mr. Johnson, visiting to discuss legal matters, found Graham and Lucy sprawled on the floor, surrounded by papers and drawings. The usually reserved solicitor smiled at the scene, noting how the girls' anxious demeanor had softened. In the garden, in stories, in small moments of connection, Lucy was beginning to trust again. The adults around her were learning too, that healing, like growing things, required both time and tender attention. And like the seeds in Francis's garden, something new and hopeful was taking root at Hawthorne Manor. The warm breeze of late May drifted through Hawthorne Manor's open windows, carrying the scent of blooming roses from the garden where Lucy played with her stuffed rabbit. As spring softened into summer, the looming custody case cast a long shadow over the tentative peace they'd established. Robert Johnson arrived one afternoon, his leather briefcase tucked under his arm. The family solicitor's expression remained professionally neutral as he spread documents across the dining table. "There's something you both need to understand about the will," he explained, adjusting his glasses. "Eleanor was always named as Lucy's primary guardian." Graham Brown's face paled. "What do you mean?" "You were added as a contingency, Mr. Brown, a backup guardian, should Eleanor prove unable or unwilling." The solicitor's voice remained gentle but firm. "Lucy's parents trusted both of you, but in different capacities." The Millionaire sank into a chair, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. All this time, his crusade had been built on a misunderstanding. He wasn't meant to be Lucy's savior, only her support. "Why wasn't I told this from the beginning?" Graham asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The terms were to be revealed only if Eleanor rejected guardianship," Robert explained, "which she never did." Eleanor watched Graham's shoulders slump, seeing not a rival but a man whose good intentions had tangled with grief and guilt. She reached across the table, her fingers briefly touching his hand. "Lucy needs both of us," she said quietly. "Different kinds of love, but both necessary." Later that evening, while searching for Lucy's summer clothes in the bedroom, Eleanor discovered a drawer she rarely opened. Inside lay a stack of letters, tied with faded ribbon, dozens of them, all addressed to Lucy in her own handwriting. She'd written them in the months after becoming Lucy's stepmother, when grief had rendered her mute with fear. Letters full of reassurances, of promises, of the love she couldn't voice aloud. Letters she'd never delivered. With trembling hands, Eleanor unfolded one dated from Lucy's first night at Hawthorne Manor. "I may not know how to be a mother," she'd written, "but I promise to try every day to deserve you." For the first time in years, Eleanor cried. Not the silent tears she'd mastered, but deep, wrenching sobs that broke something loose inside her chest. She understood now that love unspoken was love wasted, and Lucy had waited long enough. Downstairs, Graham sat with Lucy, helping her draw pictures for Francis's birthday. He looked up as Eleanor entered, her eyes red but clear, a bundle of letters in her hands. The morning of the custody hearing dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Eleanor Smith's chest. She smoothed Lucy's dress with trembling hands, trying to mask her fear with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Remember, just tell the truth," Eleanor whispered, tucking a strand of hair behind Lucy's ear. "Whatever you want is what matters most." The courtroom felt impossibly large to 6-year-old Lucy. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, now worn from constant handling, as if it might shield her from the weight of all the grown-up stares. Graham Brown sat on the opposite side, his normally confident posture now rigid with anxiety. He offered Lucy a small wave, which she returned with the tiniest wiggle of her rabbit's paw. Frances Davis settled beside Eleanor, her weathered hand finding her niece's and squeezing gently. "Breathe," the elderly woman murmured. "The child knows her own heart." Judge Sarah Davis entered, her robes sweeping behind her as she took her place at the bench. Unlike many family court judges who'd grown hardened over years of bitter custody battles, Mrs. Davis maintained a gentle authority that immediately commanded respect without intimidation. "This court's primary concern is the welfare of Lucy Smith," she stated, her gaze moving between the adults before settling on the little girl. "I understand this has been a difficult time for everyone." Mr. Robert Johnson, the family solicitor, presented the legal documents with his usual precision, outlining the complexities of the will and the competing claims. The judge listened attentively, occasionally glancing at Lucy, who was growing increasingly pale. "Lucy," Judge Davis finally said, her voice softening as she addressed the child directly. "I'd like to hear from you now. Is that all right?" The courtroom fell silent. Lucy's small fingers tightened around her rabbit as she stood. The weight of the decision pressed down on her narrow shoulders. "Where would you like to live, Lucy?" the judge asked gently. Lucy looked at Eleanor, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears, then at Graham, whose face reflected the same desperate hope. Finally, she glanced at Frances, who simply nodded encouragement. "I want to stay with Eleanor," Lucy whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But I want Graham and Frances too. Can't we all be together?" The simplicity of her request echoed through the hushed courtroom. The adults exchanged stunned glances, the solution they'd been fighting over suddenly reframed by a child's wisdom. Judge Davis leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," she said, "the most complicated problems have the simplest answers." The afternoon light streamed through the windows of Hawthorne Manor as they prepared for their return home. Graham Brown knelt beside Lucy's small suitcase, carefully folding her favorite sweater. His hands paused when he noticed her stuffed rabbit sitting oddly on the bed. Something about its weight seemed off. "Lucy, may I check your rabbit? It feels different," he asked gently. The little girl nodded, watching with curious eyes as Graham examined the well-loved toy. His fingers discovered a small tear in the seam, and as he investigated further, he felt something solid inside. Carefully, he reached in and pulled out a small golden locket. "What's that?" Lucy whispered, moving closer. Graham's hands trembled slightly as he opened the delicate clasp. Inside were 4 perfectly preserved photographs, one of Lucy's parents, one of Eleanor, one of himself, and one of Frances. The images had been carefully trimmed to fit the tiny frames, clearly assembled with loving intention. "Eleanor," he called, his voice catching, "you need to see this." Eleanor entered the room, her expression shifting from concern to wonder as Graham placed the locket in her palm. "It was hidden inside the rabbit all this time," he explained. Frances Davis appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unusual tone in Graham's voice. "What have you found?" the elderly woman asked, adjusting her glasses. "A message," Eleanor whispered, showing the locket to Frances. "From Lucy's mother." The solicitor, Mr. Johnson, who had been reviewing final paperwork in the hallway, paused at the threshold, witnessing the moment without intruding. "She wanted us together," Graham said, realization dawning in his eyes. All of us. She must have known. Lucy reached for the locket, her small fingers tracing the faces inside. Mummy put everyone I love in one place, she said simply, with the clarity that sometimes only children possess. Eleanor knelt beside Lucy, tears gathering in her eyes. Your mother was very wise, she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. She knew what we needed before we did. Frances placed her weathered hand on Eleanor's shoulder. Some bonds are meant to be, even when we fight against them. The four of them stood in a circle, the locket gleaming between them, a physical manifestation of the trust that had been placed in their hands. The walls that had separated them, pride, fear, grief, seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by something stronger. Graham looked at Eleanor, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a rival, but as someone who loved Lucy just as fiercely as he did. We don't have to do this alone, he said quietly. Eleanor nodded, finally understanding that family wasn't about blood or legal documents. It was about choosing to love, even when it was difficult, especially then. Autumn swept through the village, painting the landscape in warm amber and crimson. The transformation outside mirrored the one occurring within Hawthorne Manor, where walls, once cold with silence, now echoed with the gentle rhythm of a family finding its way. Eleanor Smith and Graham Brown developed a co-parenting routine that, while initially filled with awkward pauses and uncertain glances, gradually evolved into something resembling harmony. They created a shared calendar for Lucy's activities, their handwriting intermingling on the kitchen board, Eleanor's neat script alongside Graham's hurried scrawl. She needs consistency, Eleanor had said one evening as they sat in the study, the fire crackling between them. Structure helps her feel safe. Graham nodded, surprising her with his lack of argument. And adventure helps her grow brave, he added softly. Frances Davis became the heartbeat of their unconventional household. The elderly woman moved about the kitchen with surprising energy, flour dusting her sleeves as she taught Lucy how to knead dough properly. Put your whole body into it, child, she'd instruct, demonstrating with hands that had prepared countless meals across decades. Under her aunt's guidance, Eleanor found herself joining these cooking lessons, her normally perfect appearance softened by smudges of chocolate or garden soil. The kitchen, once merely functional, transformed into the manor's true center. In the garden, Frances created a special plot just for Lucy. Everything worth having takes patience, she explained, as they planted bulbs that would sleep through winter before blooming. Lucy listened intently, her small fingers patting the soil with care. Mr. Johnson surprised them all by becoming Lucy's unexpected advocate. The solicitor, typically reserved in his professional capacity, began asking Lucy directly about her preferences during family discussions. "And what does Miss Lucy think about this arrangement?" became his gentle refrain, ensuring the adults never forgot whose happiness they were building toward. The village, which had once whispered about Eleanor's coldness and questioned her capability as a mother, slowly revised its opinion. They watched as she stood waiting at the school gate each afternoon, how she knelt regardless of her elegant clothing to meet Lucy at eye level. The way she carried both Lucy's backpack and stuffed rabbit without complaint. "She's transformed," the baker commented to her customers, having witnessed Eleanor patiently helping Lucy select a treat, their foreheads nearly touching as they debated the merits of chocolate versus cinnamon. What the villagers couldn't see were the quiet evenings when Eleanor, Graham, and Frances sat together after Lucy was asleep, carefully building something none of them had expected. A family formed not from obligation, but from choice. On a crisp evening, Lucy Smith walked hand in hand between Eleanor and Graham, her handmade scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. The locket containing the treasured family photos rested over her heart, a constant reminder of the love that surrounded her. Autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet as they made their way back to Hawthorne Manor after visiting Frances in the village. Look at the stars coming out. Graham pointed upward, his voice gentle. The millionaire who had once stormed into their lives with legal papers and determination now spoke with the easy comfort of family. Lucy gazed upward, her small face illuminated by moonlight. "They're like tiny nightlights," she whispered, squeezing both their hands. Eleanor smiled. The reserve that had once made her seem cold now softened into quiet strength. "Your mother loved stargazing," she said, the words no longer painful to share. As they approached the manor, golden light spilled from its windows. Inside, Francis had prepared dinner, the aroma of freshly baked bread greeting them as they entered. The elderly woman wiped her hands on her apron and winked at Lucy. "Just in time," Francis announced. "Mr. Johnson is joining us tonight." The family solicitor stood by the fireplace, his usual professional demeanor relaxed in the warmth of the home. He had become more than just an advisor. He was part of the circle that protected Lucy. Later, as they gathered around the dining table, Lucy looked at each face, Eleanor's elegant features now animated with genuine laughter, Graham's eyes crinkling at the corners as he told a story, Francis passing dishes with practiced care, Mr. Johnson offering quiet observations that made everyone smile. 6 months ago, this scene would have been impossible. The custody battle that had threatened to tear them apart had instead forged something stronger, a family built not on obligation, but on choice. In her bedroom that night, Lucy placed her stuffed rabbit on the pillow beside her. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, no longer hesitant to brush the child's hair from her forehead. "Are you happy, Lucy?" she asked softly. The little girl nodded. "I don't have to be afraid anymore," she said with 6-year-old wisdom. No longer did Lucy whisper, "Please don't leave me." Instead, she smiled, knowing she belonged, not because of a will or a name, but because 3 broken adults had chosen to become whole together, for her and for themselves. And for the first time since Lucy could remember, Hawthorne Manor was truly home, not just a grand house with shadowy hallways, but a sanctuary filled with laughter, second chances, and the quiet miracle of everyday love.